We're all good? All right. All right, well, thanks for the introduction. So always with media posts, I've been to quite a few. There's always a few stories that go around. So once I have the panel introduce themselves, we do have a story that I think will be kind of relevant and something that you will always talk about years after this. So with that, I'm Ashley Evenson. I'm the Director of Emerging Media and Ad Solutions for Ciceron, a digital media agency. I'll have the panel introduce themselves as well as this epic story.
My name is Ahmed, Director of Programmatic Data and Insights at Active International. And to me, I look at programmatic being like fishing. I know a lot of people here know I'm kind of an expert in that field. So when you think about it, like with programmatic, you're trying to find audiences. Think of it like the ocean. There's so many fish out there. When you're catching the fish, that's like the conversion. When you're doing retargeting, you're fishing in a small pond, and you got so many tactics available, like in terms of finding the right audience, finding them via sites, finding them via data, via who they are and whatnot. So, and the fact that you can scale and you have so much control, all in one platform, to me, that's why I love programmatic.
And then can you give the details about the fish?
We can talk about the fish after. I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard about it.
I will say, actually, that it can be somewhat deflating to follow such a legendary nautical adventure description as we heard outside. But nevertheless, Pietro Bartoli, Digitas, programmatic lead for Chicago and San Francisco.
I'm Liza Paley. I'm an associate director at PhD Media, part of Omnicom Media Group. And I oversee a team that handles search, social, and programmatic.
Great. So as we were doing the panel prep, so right now you have 4 agency folks on this panel. So we definitely will have a different point of view than if there was someone from a brand on this panel really talking about the data fees, the ROI behind it, and how we're managing that for a lot of our clients. So as you're thinking about this, we have the agency point of view to start off with. To provide more context to the audience here, I first thought we start with first discussing our technology stack, our data stack, so that when we start talking about the ROI, the data fees, and how that all rolls up, you have more context to how we're structured. So with that, I think we'll just kind of go down the line to start, and then we'll begin the conversation from there. But if you could each explain how you are working with data providers, how you're bringing that data into DSPs, and if you are bringing that data into social, if you could paint a better picture for the audience.
Right, so with us, we're actually, first we partner with different data providers depending on what's available and what our clients are looking for. We're actually working on building a data arm where we can plug in different types of data providers and then have them integrated through either API or another way with our DSP, so that way, if depending on the client that we have, we can say, okay, this data provider would be perfect for you. It's an easier transition that way than always just reaching out to a data provider and then manually pulling that data in one by one. We're trying to find a way that we can put everything in one umbrella and then have it plug in basically just at an ease of a button. So.
Yes, at Digitas right now, we're actually scrutinizing the data at a high level. So for example, we've developed a RFI of sorts, that a uniform series of questions that we serve to all of our data providers and new ones as well, attempting to identify specifically their methodology for categorization and processing. And I think that there's a healthy concern among a lot of brands and marketers about the validity of the data. So that's probably step one. In terms of the ingestion of the data, as we've talked about in the past couple of days, the majority of third-party segments are available through syndicated, sort of always-on libraries and the DSPs, and there might be custom segments created, and that's facilitated through a partnership between the provider and the DSP.
There is a ton of nuance between every single client at Omnicom in terms of the data they're using, their tech stack, just marketing technology they lean into in general. I think what's interesting is that, and we've kind of talked about this before, there are some clients that hold a contract directly with a data provider or a measurement provider, whereas there are others that look to us to be an expert and kind of give them that recommendation on who we want them to work with based on what their campaign goals are. So I would say there's no one answer. At Omnicom, like you heard yesterday about Omni, one of the main benefits of Omni is that it doesn't rely on any single source of data. So we're able to really customize by client the different data sources we're going to bring in, whether that's geodata, behavioral, bidstream, purchase-based, a lot of purchase-based on my CPG clients particularly. And then also, like we talked about, we are bringing that into social, which has been definitely much different than in the programmatic space, where you look at so in the programmatic space, when you're using third-party data with a few of the partners that we lean into the most, you're looking at like a CPM uptick, and that's how we can account for that data. But in the social space, you're looking at a % of media. So been much more difficult to track, like we've kind of talked about, and I don't know if you guys have had more or better experience with tracking those dollars. Actually, when we were talking last week, or I guess earlier this week, about how we're actually tracking all of that, we found that a lot of us are using Excel documents to track that. And I was telling Ashley, we're looking for a better way to do this. Lo and behold, yesterday I got an email that Omnicom is rolling out a technology that I was pleased to hear about to help us track all of that. But I would say overall, a lot of nuance by client.
Yeah, so as she had mentioned, we really bonded over some of the stressors over the last, even the 6 months with bringing in this data. What is interesting about this panel, and as we all know, things change so fast, is I think we each have a different point of view. Where Liza has those brands, those clients that do have those individual contracts, where some of us, don't have that experience, and we do push our clients to own their own data, to get a DMP, to own the contracts, but there is some limitations on the brand side as well. So keeping track of that is, very, very cumbersome. And the biggest pain point, Liza and I had talked about was obviously, again, buzzword here, the walled garden of social. What we're running into is, okay, we can now push data into that since, it was pulled, 6 to 8 months ago. We are able now to push data into social using mobile advertising IDs, and then some data providers can do custom audience segments. But the biggest troublesome thing there is, when we were pushing data into the DSPs before, all that reporting was rolled up. Well, now it's in good faith of us to provide answers back to the data company on how many impressions we're delivering because of this walled garden. So to loop this all back around, hopefully that gave you guys a better picture of how the stacks work, what we're doing to kind of lead into more of the ROI conversation. So now to get to data fees. So a lot of our data partners have different CPM models, or if it's a percentage of media, it can vary. And how we are getting that data, whether that's off the shelf within the DSP, if we have the individual contract and things of that sorts. How are you, when you're presenting a media strategy to a client, and here's another buzzword, transparency, how are you presenting these data fees to the client, at the start of a strategy or at a campaign level?
So, again, personally, when we're running a campaign, we're partnered with so many different data providers. Before we even use them, we look at the quality of data. Deterministic data is always the priority for us. And then we look at the campaign, our client's objectives, and see which data point makes the most sense to plug in. We usually calculate all of the fees beforehand, and then we give the client basically the CPM of how it would look with media and data involved. So how we do it is we kind of blend it all in and then figure out what that CPM would be depending on the data that we want to access, and basically calculate the ROI on that. So it's not like it's, okay, you're paying this much on media, this much on data, this much, because even if you're buying through a DSP direct using their own data, there's still a CPM that you have to factor in, right? So with this, you kind of look at it the same way, but you're just plugging in a different data source. Sure, the CPM is going to be a little bit higher, but the quality of your users are going to be that much better.
I think there's two parts to this. Yes, number one, when we're planning, I don't think we explicitly separate our predictions of data costs. We do certainly have, through historical information, a very nice expectation of ranges in which they might fall. But I think given that the overarching goal, right, is really the bottom line. So the price of a certain piece of data is not the primary concern, right? It's more the value of it, right? So more expensive data may not really be more expensive, right? It might be cheaper in terms of value. So, however, we do have the ability, of course, and it's generally the case that DSPs can delineate the tech fees, the raw media cost, the data cost. So we're very forthcoming with the separation of other costs and data if the client desires to see that.
Great. And then Liza, I know as you had talked about at Omnicom, it varies. Can you speak both towards how you're managing this when the client has their own DMP versus when you have your agency DMP or DSP? How are you managing the differences between those two?
So there are cost differences, obviously, that come into play if a singular entity is negotiating a contract for a singular brand. That's why, generally speaking, we'll see clients look to us to lean into whatever DSP that we're using across the board. For example, on one of our smaller brands, they get to leverage the fact that McDonald's is one of our clients and State Farm is one of our clients. So the budget that comes behind a much larger brand for a smaller brand, there's a ton of value there. So I would say that definitely comes into play. To kind of stay with the theme here and answer your original question, I think what's interesting across the board, I think this holds true with any holding company, any agency, not only do all of your clients operate a little differently, but oftentimes you won't have clients that understand much around media. So trying to strike the balance between, what do they want to hear? What do they not want to hear? Are they focused on, one of their competitors who just lowered prices on their brand? Oftentimes that's much bigger priority than where, what our data costs are when it comes to media. So I would say a big part of our jobs is reading a room, being cognizant of what your clients want to hear, what they don't want to hear. I will say it's a pleasure to hear a lot of you who spoke from the brand side, being so knowledgeable about the media space, but also I would say on the agency side, kind of a blessing and a curse to have clients who do get it. Personally, I love being challenged by clients who are like, well, what is that? And well, what is, where are our ads actually living? And what's the difference between outstream and instream? And they want to learn about that. But also, it's important to understand when a client doesn't want to hear that and they just want to get the down and dirty and understand, did my ads deliver what you said they would, or something along those lines?
Yeah, and we'll get into ROI in a second. What I had alluded to a little bit earlier, I think things were more, cut and dry. We could follow better processes with keeping track of data. And again, back to the social standpoint, Liza and I have really could have a drink over this, just the painfulness.
And we will later.
Yes, definitely. With, how we're keeping track in this, it's really social that really kind of threw us for a loop because of the walled garden and not having an understanding. So just being really transparent with our client, breaking everything down, even developing now, she just said, Omnicom is coming out with an internal software. I know my agency is developing a software to do this because it's literally brand spanking new, pushing into social like we're doing. So that kind of now leads into how are we tracking this? So as we just talked about 5 to 10 minutes ago is how are we being transparent more so on the campaign and media strategy, but how are we being transparent on a reporting standpoint and really backing into return on ad spend and ROI to make sure, like, okay, what are our data costs versus actually what are we spending in media, and is it worth it? I know during our panel prep, can't remember who brought it up, but there should be a difference between these data costs. What is our approach on a brand versus more of a direct response client? So I can't quite remember who said that on the call, so I'm going to pass it to whoever brought that point up to discuss your thoughts on brand versus direct response with the data fees.
Sure. Well, I think in general, it depends on the transactional methods of the products and services for a given brand, right? Some methods are more amenable to a direct, more causal ROI, and some are more of a correlation. I think in the branding realm, there's generally a bit more tolerance and flexibility with data costs, right? As the media is typically more expensive, and in a direct response realm, so to speak. But we can argue about the classification of branding and DR. I think that's somewhat conveniently but mischaracterized. But in a more tightly defined KPI goal, there's more scrutiny about it. I think, and I'm thinking about a paradigm of a certain home appliance client. I think there's certain data, we'll call it branding data, that might be foundational, right? So it's a prerequisite for certain people to have certain characteristics to target them. So I'm thinking a couple things. One, Yogi's conversation about advanced auto parts. It's probably foundational that people own an automobile, right? People may want to accumulate auto parts just for the sake of anticipating an auto, or just for the satisfaction of wanting strong parts, but generally that's a prerequisite. In certain appliance issues, there might be the need for someone to be a homeowner. So those type of data will be long-standing and universally present. And then there might be more experimental data, right? And this moves down in, let's say, a hierarchy. There might be life stage data that is seemingly somewhat critical, very likely, right, to be important. That might be used in some amount, and there might be more granular experimental data that's nuanced, such as a certain interest in a certain activity, for example. So that's used perhaps less and changed over more frequently. In terms of ROI, I think that again, I'll give you a couple examples. So first of all, the data can be test and controlled against each other, and it can be test and controlled with data and no data. And I think test and control is an important thing to periodically do to validate the value of something. But we have a client whose purchases are predominantly in brick and mortar, and that can be difficult to close the gap there, right? So what we've done is partnered with Placed, for example, and track the number of ad exposed users who visit one of several relevant retailers, and then serve those visitors a customized survey. And in that survey, we gather information such as the purpose of their visit, the brand, the appliance under consideration, and ultimately the brand purchased. And from that, we glean a purchase rate and an average combined with an average order value. We produce a very estimated return. And so that could be a way to establish a return on ad spend in that context.
So for both of you, as he's talking about the ROI, again, brand versus direct response. Direct response, I mean, it's very crucial that we're backing into that return on ad spend goal. For my agency personally, we are using Domo, and then we're putting logic in the back end to make sure that the data fees are transparent. What are you guys doing to help, especially the direct response clients, on these data fees in a reporting standpoint?
So again, when we're executing these campaigns, we're not really separating the data fees. However, to your point, there is a cost to that. So to me, when I'm executing campaigns, regardless if it's branding or direct response, there's always an action. There's always something that we're trying to accomplish here. And we can't always look at just clicks, because over time what's going to happen is you put in your KPI, okay, clicks is your KPI, and then it's going to start favoring, let's say, more mobile inventory, that clicks are mainly accidental, or they're just generating more clicks. So I always like to place pixels, regardless if it's branding or acquisition, and then from there, I see what is happening on the site. So now it's easy where you can place just one pixel, because you don't want your client spending days and days, okay, place this pixel here, this pixel here, this pixel here. You place one pixel, and then on our end, we would create the rules. So if there's any engagement on the site, if a user is hitting more than one page, if they're going to a specific page, learn more, find a store, that's the kind of traffic that we want to report on. And then to your point with the cost, and speaking on what Pietro was saying, we will test, so we will see how the extra fees associated with the data that we're bringing in is performing against, let's say, the data that's already available in the DSP or no data or whatnot. And then from there, we look at the quality of traffic. Is one generating more users on site, more page visits, more engagements, and we also measure in-store visits. So if somebody saw an ad and then we're able to see, okay, this person saw an ad, did they come to the store? And one of our providers also gives us a lift. So obviously a lot of people are going to go to the store anyway, but then we do a control versus test to see the true impact of that. Was there an incremental lift by running the media? And usually data always wins. Like, even though there is that extra cost, you're always getting that extra value because it's always giving you more quality.
I was just going to 100% that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in the CPG realm specifically, which takes up most of my day-to-day, when I think about the data we're layering on, the first conversation needs to be measurement. If we're not setting ourselves up for success in terms of how we're measuring and looking at different data sources, then it's kind of like, what are we doing? You can't measure the effectiveness of data on, generally speaking, media and inventory KPIs. So where we've gotten to, you read recently a lot about CPGs wanting to understand, not just what is our reach and what's the effect of branding, but how are we driving offline sales? And like you heard from Ashley, it's really tough to do when you're not getting that data back from retailers. So what we're moving into right now on one of our biggest CPGs in the Chicago office is working with a third-party measurement partner who our client they work with them directly, and they're their main measurement partner of choice. So that's kind of why we lean that direction. But working with them to understand sales against all of our products weekly. And then, so they're working with the retailers, and that's how we're kind of, in a sidestep kind of way, getting that data to understand what data is having an impact. That's proven really difficult to do. So far it's been a 7-month process that I'm hoping gets somewhere and then translates to Omnicom and translates to the rest of the industry in the next year or so. But really think about specifically when you can't get your hands on your own sales data, how do you lean on partners to understand, what does that effectiveness of different data sources look like? And if we're going to run a test, of course, control exposed, especially from a closed loop perspective, is very effective. But I don't want to use data I'm getting, or results I'm getting 3 months after the wrap of a campaign to inform the next year, because like we've been talking about the past 2 days, things are moving at lightning speed, and you can't look back to look forward. So really thinking about how can we get that data in as close to real time as possible, knowing that's not possible right now in the programmatic space or just more generally in the media space when we don't have access to your sales data immediately.
Great. And to kind of piggyback on that, so kind of the three of you have touched on it, the testing of the data. As agencies, we're just not using data for the use of data. We're making sure that there is a ROI and we're backing into the client's goals. What is the criteria for testing data, and what is the duration that you typically look at?
Yeah, sure. So criteria for data, first and foremost, is transparency. So we're looking at I think there's a difference when you think about data that comes at a cost and data that doesn't come at a cost. But specifically when you think about data that comes at a cost, number one is understanding exactly what's going into that, specifically modeled segments. So we're moving as close to, building ideally predictive segments off of really strong seeds. That's been a major consideration. I just went in one direction and probably didn't even answer your question. Will you repeat the original question?
Well, what was the criteria and what is your testing period?
Transparency, thank you. Yes, transparency number one. I'm really lucky to have a team, Brooke and team, who really dig into what the marketplace has to offer and make sure that we as an agency have that additional support and understanding who are the best partners out there, specifically third party, because there's a lot of modeling that's going on, understandably, right? Like you have to be able to scale, but ideally we're building those models off of really strong seeds. I don't think there's a single answer to like a cadence or a frequency of, what does a test need to look like? So I think that's a really good question. I think you have to give it enough time. I mean, a lot of my clients run campaigns for like 9 months at a time, and my goal is to learn on at least a weekly level what is working and what's not working, and then iterate from there, but not have it be a single start and stop and then throw your hands up in the air and not touch it for another year. So you continue to learn and then implement what you're learning.
And, I think too, as technology improves, hopefully that we can lean on, these reporting dashboards and AI to help make some correlations. I agree. I think on a weekly standpoint, we are, testing and learning, but we do have some clients who are almost, for how tight numbers are, we are looking on a daily standpoint. So I think it's a use case per client.
Yes, I agree with that. Transparency is desirable. I mentioned the RFI that we might send out, right? And I'm sure people would share the view that it can be challenging to really dig in with a third-party data provider, right?
Yes.
There's lots of commonly cited methods of collecting data and segmenting, but do you know the criteria precisely by which they put people in different names and how long they're in that name and such things? So for example, a very relevant example for us is in-market data, right? There's lots of in-market data, but in-market since when and how are they removed, and is it an immediate in-market? Is it a moderate consideration? And all these things are arguably important and could be addressed separately, but it's valuable to know that. And then I think secondly, and perhaps ultimately, right, the criteria for the continued use of data will be the impact it has, right? So the result in the aggregate of the outcome.
Just quickly touching on that, transparency and accuracy, because there could be, like, for example, find out what makes up each segment. If somebody's passing you data that says, okay, I have foodies over here, and then how'd you qualify this person as being a foodie? Oh, they visited How to Cook a Turkey site. Okay, that's not enough to qualify that person as a foodie. So you really want to find out what is making up each person. Do they have more than just one data point? Did they not only visit that How to Cook a Turkey, but are they also visiting other sites that are talking about different recipes, like if there's more than one data point, then yes, then you know that that data is qualified, it's vetted, and it's worth it. On top of that, we always prioritize deterministic data as much as it can be. And then to your point about the recency, it all depends on the client. You don't want to target somebody that was searching for a trip to Cuba, let's say 30 days ago, because they would already be back by the time you target them 3 days after and have salmonella poisoning and the other good stuff.
Yeah, and perhaps someone's investigating the brine, right? That's a deeper indicator besides just the turkey cooking.
There you go.
And I would be the person asking how to cook a turkey and not a foodie.
You should watch a Jenny O ad.
All right. So we've talked a lot about data in kind of the programmatic sense, the social sense, but how are we using this data in a meaningful way in other marketing objectives? Are you using this data, looking at lookalikes based on site traffic to update creative, or rearranging your website? How are you using this data in other marketing objectives?
So when we're targeting and using this data, you always want to respond to the data. You never want to, let's say, put up front what you don't want to tell the system what to do. You want to see what the system is telling you and then optimize towards that. So to your point, if the data is coming in and then I'm finding a new segment or a new audience that my client never knew about that we can touch into, that's great insight that we can share. That's a new avenue that we can tap into. Like, for example, we're running this campaign for a truck company, and we were targeting, let's say, construction workers and people into sports and whatnot. But then we found, based on the data, that country music lovers are big truck drivers. Like, they're a big category that we haven't tapped into. And that was meaningful insight that we passed back to the client, and then we were like, hey, let's test this out. Let's find more of those type of people, and you'll always find a new audience to tap into that you can leverage for other initiatives.
Yes, you mentioned lookalikes, so I think that's rather commonplace now. I think there's valuable functionality native to platforms that can produce interesting lookalikes, both in a manual and an automated fashion. But I think beyond that, there's a general desire to try to go outside of that and to work with partners, and not necessarily these massive third-party data aggregator partners, but perhaps more niche ones that have a methodology that is genuinely unique to them. So I think there's a lot of exciting opportunity there. But again, the other thing I'd mention that I thought was interesting, and it's not necessarily related to third-party data, but I do like the point that Yogi made about looking at data more generally to manage inventory. So taking it outside of the advertising specific and tying it to something as important as that. And very often you might hear about that type of expansive data consideration in the context of a CDP or things like that. But I think that's something that can be considered as well.
Yeah, we've had some, actually in the past year or so, with being able to lean into Omni a little more, which I know I'm talking about a lot, but I'm oddly very excited about it. But being able to look at the data and understand new insights about our customers has been very interesting, and I think something that our clients honestly can't even believe. So for example, if on one of our clients, they're very firm on exactly who their customer is for a specific product, and using insights based on the data we were analyzing after one of the campaigns told us, actually it's, if you think your target is women 25 to 54, well, it's actually men 55 plus who are engaging the most with our ads. That's been, maybe that's kind of an odd example, but things like that, finding really niche targets, and kind of opening up the eyes of our clients to understand, yes, maybe we've been looking at this a certain way for the past 30 years, but we have an opportunity to actually look at what is the data telling us, not just, what do we think, what is our, not necessarily our common sense, but again, when you don't have that sales data at your fingertips, what does our common sense often tell us about specific products and specific alignments? And then I would say on top of that, one of the ways that a lot of our teams are pulling learnings across channels and potentially outside of media as well is thinking about, when you have a programmatic search, social, and SEO team working really closely together, literally sitting at the same table, how are you cross-sharing those learnings, and where are you able to learn the quickest, and then how can you translate that to another channel? So if we're learning something, within a week in the programmatic space, or how are we able to, work with our creative counterparts to change our potential social strategy, and that happens throughout the course of the campaign, and I think that's much more possible when a team works really closely together, regardless of where that is.
Yeah, and I think for us to, to kind of piggyback on what you just said, like the learnings between channels, so historically the location-based data was made readily available within the DSPs. With now us being able to bring in mobile advertising ideas as custom audience segments into social, we were able to replicate what we were doing in programmatic into the social aspect and taking those learnings.
Yeah, we've definitely gone down the same path and thinking about, if we're going to use a specific purchase-based segment, should we use that in the programmatic pipes and in social, and how do we make sure that we're not over-frequencying people, and how do we build out that strategy, which is, so much easier when you have it all living in one place and having one team overseeing that.
Great. Looks like we're on time check.
Yeah, well, I would like to move to Q&A, and we've got a question back here, or a couple of questions back here.
Hi, Brooke with Omnicom. So we talked a lot about hard costs, and I have kind of a two-pronged question. Can you talk about more of like the verification data partners that you're using? And on top of that, how do you talk about the CPM inflation that happens, not necessarily just a data cost? Because, YouTube specifically, when we use partners to what I would call verify the inventory or curate it, the cost might be like 10% of media, but the CPM inflation could be like 50%. So do you have those conversations, and how do you approach them?
Brooke knows my answer, so then I'll pass it off to you guys, but for everyone else. My favorite slide that we show in some of our programmatic 101s with clients is a picture of a cat and a tiger. And it says, you can't buy tiger CPM or tiger inventory and data at cat CPMs. And that really resonates with our clients, because they're like, okay, you really do have to, and what we've talked about a little, almost take out insurance on your buys. And there's real value to making sure that, specifically in YouTube, for example, you're being extra careful, because there are a lot of brands that have been hit hard there. But I think there's a ton of value to having those conversations, and it's really difficult to quantify. But I think that as an industry, we're moving in that direction, I would say, at least for us.
Yes, I think of a few different items there. One, again, not to belabor the point, but I think that first and foremost, if the data together with the CPM results in a acceptable outcome, that's at least momentarily fine. That said, I think there should be an ongoing pursuit to find the spot at which we can still get the quality, right, but pay as little as you can for it. So I think some kind of systematic experimentation with perhaps lowering bids, right, is appropriate. I think there's also, as we know, there's a lot of interesting developments in the space regarding the bids, right? So probably the most notable example is the first price, second price auction, right? At first, that was very remarkable and perhaps troubling for people, right? Bidding $45 for marketing audiences and coming in at 17, not knowing if they'll come in at 17 or pay 45. So what you have, though, is a rapid development of tools that seek to solve that problem, right? There was Rubicon's tool, Trade Desk has the COA that originally was seeking to, let's say, identify when an auction is first and second price and then modify that bid. And now you have SSPs moving more towards a first price anyway, so maybe that issue is now less critical and more commonplace. But I agree, one should be aware of the CPMs and should not just leave it there. I think there could easily be a situation where people are fine and they just set it and forget it piece, and I think one should avoid that.
Yeah, and to what we had talked on our panel prep call is, we're willing to pay, like the tiger, pay more on a CPM standpoint if it's working, and if we are having that ROI on it.
They're both beautiful animals, though. I do think so.
I completely agree.
Hi, it's Rob from USIM, and well done, Ahmed, on avoiding fish talk. So I have a quick question. Could you talk a little bit about how you have helped clients to set programmatic in the wider scheme of ROI? So, what role does it play? How does programmatic contribute? How do the other marketing programs that clients are doing contribute to programmatic ROI? How have you helped to kind of quantify that in the larger picture of everything that clients are doing?
We've definitely had to have a number of much larger conversations, I would say over the past probably 3 years maybe, to stop thinking about programmatic as just a line item and start thinking about it as a method of activation. And I think it's on us as partners and as oftentimes the ones who are not only building out the strategy but leading activation, to make sure our clients are aware of that. So, yeah, I would say
100%. And Brooke said the same thing yesterday, which that it's a means to an end, right? It's a method of transaction, and people do refer to it as a line item. They categorize the programmatic team and the search team, the social team. I'd like to see programmatic as a word not being used in a number of years, right? And arguably at its essential, the essential components of its definition, you could say search is programmatic and social is also programmatic.
So with programmatic, the way I see it, it's talking to people that are not thinking about your product at that time, and you're trying to put that product in their head. So when you're measuring programmatic with everything else, to what Liza was saying, you shouldn't look at it as a separate line item. Look at what everything is doing together. When you're running your programmatic campaign, are you seeing a lift in searches with your SEM campaign? Are you noticing there's a lot more site traffic? Are you seeing any increases in all your other channels? Now you can also look at attribution, and I know my friend Brian was talking about last touch and first touch. So that's also something that you can look at when you have an attribution partner, third-party data server that you're, everything is kind of on the same playing field per se. But again, like when you're running the campaign, are you seeing anything that's rising from that? Are you building more net new audiences from that?
Yeah, I think it's just the overall campaign strategy, and actually it drives me nuts, the term programmatic, because what he said, essentially all digital media is now programmatic. Social, search, it's all, how I define it is buying media through the use of data, and that's all platforms. And I like the term biddable media.
Yeah, agreed. I would even say, 4 or 5 years ago when we would just have programmatic as a single slide, or probably not even in a tactical recommendation, the same way you might expect, 4 or 5 slides in a recommendation outlining your big event sponsorship with Rolling Stone. You should expect the same, if not more, out of what your programmatic strategy looks like, to really understand exactly what's going into it and how everything is working together. Because I would say, oftentimes we don't do a good enough job at showing off all the great work that's going into a programmatic strategy, because there's so much, and a lot of people still think about it as kind of like a black box, which I think just comes down to like education and leaning on your partners to educate you or educating yourself. But it's fair to have that expectation in my eyes, to really understand all that's going into a programmatic buy, because there's a lot, as we in the room all know.
Hi, it's Sean Robertson Dish again. Great information shared on the panel, and I fully agree. Within our walls, when we're transacting with partners, our full sales team is well-versed in linear, programmatic, addressable. And the way I look at it is saying, when you go to the cash register, do you want to pay with your MasterCard, your Visa, cash, or check? The challenge we have on our side is when we go to an agency, there is the programmatic team activating the programmatic budget, there is the digital team, there is the TV team. So to that end, in your desired world, what's being done to educate across the silos, break down those walls, and make sure that the right people in the right room talking to the client, so that when you come to us with the strategy, we're having one conversation?
Well, I think first and foremost, after an examination of the brief, let's say, there needs to be perhaps a delineation between pursuits over certain periods of time. Right, so if we can establish that we have an ongoing brand building goal, and then we also have a more immediate sales activation goal, and those terms I think are from the Binet Field Marketing Effectiveness Study. But then we can have a more meaningful conversation about the role of the channels, if you will. So at present, everything isn't absolutely combined, but we can say we're not going to evaluate each channel based upon the lowest CPA. We are fine. In fact, we are enthusiastic about having programmatic lay a foundation that yields rewards in the distance, right? And if you can do that, and to your point, if we can look at it over a multi-touch view, and we can say that yes, these prospecting line items with data, they don't yield a good CPA. They might have no CPA, but we've identified that they're contributory to the ultimate conversion. Then you can have a sustainable campaign that's not populated by discussions of should we cut this and should we cut that.
Really getting away to your point, like on the last click standpoint, because you do need those prospecting awareness channels to give overall lift too. So how are you combining that across all channels to create that strategy?
Yeah, and I would say, speaking to our partners in the space, it's really important to have everyone in the room, and we've felt that in the past couple of years, and we announced a big reorg about a month ago that's bringing digital to the forefront of strategy and planning, and it's kind of like what Omni was a part of, but really how we're feeling that internally is bringing the traditional activation teams upstream into planning. So I would say, we make an effort to make sure that all the appropriate players are in the room so that we're all on the same page, but you're preaching to the choir, and I'd say it's going to be a joint effort partnership to make sure that we're bringing everyone in so everyone's on the same page.
Ashley and panel, we're going to move this to a roundtable in a minute. Thanks, that was a great discussion.
Thank you.
No more questions about fish? No?
And you guys gave,
Fish?
was there